And so that was my first exposure to Gilbey's gin. I was thinking, why would you do that? Why would you drink that? That's awful.
Hello and welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon, and I am here today at the doctor's office in Seattle, Washington with Paul Clarke. Now, Paul, I know you as the editor-in-chief of Imbibe Magazine, and Imbibe actually played a really formative part in my cocktail journey and spirits journey.
Fantastic.
As I imagine it did for a lot of people, but I think I spied an Imbibe on the rack at my local shop, probably one of the first handful of issues.
Okay.
And I picked it up and I subscribed, and I was a subscriber for years until I realized I had a stack of unread Imbibes about this high. And now I just get it on the website. But it's been a great resource, I think, for so many people. So thank you for that. And why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and Imbibe?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Paul Clarke. I'm the editor-in-chief of Imbibe. I've been there for a little over 10 years, and I've been working with the magazine since issue number 1 in 2006 in one capacity or another. I've been a journalist covering spirits, cocktails, and the culture of drink for 20 years now. And I also host the Radio Imbibe podcast, as well as doing lots of judgy type things for spirits competitions, cocktail competitions, and things of that nature.
Yeah, and I was saying to Paul before that it's a little disconcerting for me to hear you in person because I'm only used to hearing you in my ears with the podcast.
Right.
Which I love. So I'm glad you get to be on my podcast.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I always ask my guests what they would like to taste, and you immediately came back and said this Gilbey's gin was for you.
Gilbey's gin is for me, absolutely. And, you know, there are a couple of reasons for that. First off, I never get the opportunity to taste Gilbey's gin, especially an older bottle. And, you know, when I saw the name pop up, it was like one of those kind of, you know, that distant memory came across where I remembered seeing it in my parents' liquor cabinet way back in the 1970s when they would entertain. Back then, it was a frosted glass bottle. It was very distinctive. And, you know, I remember the magazine advertisements you'd see like in Time magazine and stuff. And honestly, I'm not sure if I've actually tasted it since it was in that frosted glass bottle from my parents' liquor cabinet decades and decades ago.
Did you sneak a sip from your parents' liquor cabinet?
It was one of those things where I think, you know, like as a kid, I was curious, and we had kind of an open household in terms of, you know, the kids got a little wine at dinner, that kind of thing. If you wanted to taste something, ask. And I remember, you know, my dad had a martini one time, and I thought, a martini, that's like the coolest, classiest thing ever. Of course, I'd love to taste that. And of course, any first taste of a martini you have, especially when you're, you know, 10 years old, is just going to be god awful.
Yeah.
And so that was my first exposure to Gilbey's gin. I was thinking, why would you do that? Why would you drink that? That's awful. But I do remember the bottles around. I do remember it being served at parties and, you know, being mixed into Tom Collins's and punches and things at the holidays. So when the opportunity came up to taste a vintage expression of it, I thought, sure, what the hell? I'd be curious to check it out and see if I've come around from that perspective I had when I was 10 years old.
Well, this one should look pretty familiar because it does still have that frosted glass.
It does have the frosted glass.
This is a Canadian bottle,
okay.
As far as I can tell, and it's but quite old. So it only says 1.6 fluid ounces, doesn't have any metric on it. When Canada went metric earlier than a lot of places did, doesn't have proof listed.
Okay.
And it's quite evaporated, so probably lower proof than it started. But in dating it, I was able to say it was before 1975 because of this frosted glass that you mentioned as being so distinctive. They started that actually during Prohibition because so many people were counterfeiting their gin that they weren't able to smuggle in their own gin, right? People were faking it. And so they actually started that to make the bottle really distinctive and hard to
Nobody
make.
gets to get in on our illegal booze game. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So any predictions? Have you tasted vintage gins before?
I have tasted vintage gins before. And so my initial expectation before seeing the bottle was thinking, well, you know, typically a lot of the botanicals are going to kind of soften and round out a little bit over the years. Juniper still manages to keep its presence. And from what I recall, from that sip of my dad's martini, Gilbey's was a very juniper-forward gin. It was a very kind of classic London dry, very kind of spiky, prickly bite of juniper. I'd anticipate that still being in this expression once we open it. But yeah, I think some of the softer botanicals may be kind of tamed down. So it might be a little bit more, you know, get a couple of things out of there, but not the full expressiveness that you would normally get.
That's sort of what I figured with gin is, that the aromatics would start to blow off, but it's good to know the juniper will remain. I am a ginny.
That's my anticipation. I mean, as you said, some of it is evaporated, so like anything could have happened to it once oxygen gets into the game.
But I am a ginny gin girl.
Okay,
so give me some juniper and I am happy. All right, let's see if we can get into this one. This is often the hardest part. All right, I'm going to ask you to give that a go. Now, this is well sealed. I mean, how did so much evaporate if it was that well sealed?
That's a good question.
All right. Well,
it is definitely softened up on the nose.
Not a lot of
This is not barking out that it's a gin.
Not.
It starts to creep up a little bit, once it opens up a little bit, but it's more like kind of the coriander lemon peel kind of thing. Like the juniper is doing exactly the opposite of what I thought it would do. It's kind of fading. In the
maybe
background.
We'll taste it, right?
Yeah,
maybe the oils are still in there.
Maybe it's just waiting for me to get complacent and then come roaring out.
I have found that sometimes these bottles are a little reticent and they take a minute.
Okay.
But the glass here is helping to concentrate it. When I first took a sniff, I couldn't even smell any alcohol or much of anything at all. I am getting a little alcohol heat now. And then these really, really subtle aromatics.
Yeah, they're starting to come out more. Yeah. You can tell, a little bit of the complexity that was in there to start off with, but it's very soft.
All right, you want to go in?
All right.
It's like an echo of gin.
Wow. Yeah. That's a good way to put it. It's very, very light. Yes. It's still, I'm getting on the finish. It has some of that fire that I remember from Gilbey's. Gilbey's has always kind of had a heat to it.
Yeah.
I'm getting some of that on the finish where there's that kind of the alcohol burn. But yeah, the juniper is almost entirely gone. Some of the spices, we thought they'd be coming through on the palate more, but really it's the nose where a lot of the spices are holding up. The palate, you get a little bit of like some of that citrus, but
I get this thing, and I know people who've been watching the show for a while will have heard me say this a million times. I get this dusty flavor with these old bottles, and that is the predominant note that I taste here.
Yeah.
It's just this sort of, I'm old.
Yeah. It's, in the glass, it's continuing to open up on the nose, but still, I think really it's just kind of the alcohol picking up whatever remnants are there and letting them flee.
And I was so sad I was so excited when I found this bottle because I've been going through Grandma's collection and I was quite deep. I can't remember the number that this bottle is, but I was a long way in and I hadn't found a single gin. And I like gin, right? And I was so bummed. And then I found this one evaporated. And I've since found a Tanqueray and it's also evaporated. Yeah. And it's like, all right, well, a shadow of a gin.
Initially I was thinking when I was expecting, that big kind of pokey, sharp profile, I was thinking, well, you could still use it in gin and tonic. I think if you put tonic water in this, you wouldn't tell there's gin there.
Right. You know what this needs? This is a martini where you do just put that
This is one of those non-existent vermouth martinis.
Yeah. Over the top of the glass.
Just stick whatever, the half ounce that's left there, stick it in the freezer and then pour it in a glass and it'll be fine.
Here's a 1970s. That's how they were drinking them back then. No,
yeah, sure.
No vermouth. That's ridiculous. All right. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
If you had gotten this one when you were a kid, you probably would have thought gin was fine.
I would have thought that's absolutely fine. I'm not necessarily delicious just because, it's not what you're anticipating. But no, it's much softer. This is a approachable gin. Just take a bottle of Gilbey's, let it sit there for 40 years, open it up, and it'll be fine.
Sounds like a plan. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining me. Where can people find out more about you?
You can find out more about us at imbibemagazine.com and on Instagram @imbibe.
And you totally should do those things because Imbibe, as I was saying, fantastic resource. And the podcast is also great. You can listen to Paul's voice in your ear.
On any of your favorite podcast platforms, and also all of our back catalog episodes are on imbibemagazine.com.
And you can find me, of course, at mytinybottles.com, or you can find me on Instagram at Facebook at mytinybottles. And you can also find me at Blue Sky at TammyLC. That's where I'm most active. So head on over to where the skies are blue and check me out there. Cheers.
Cheers.